thank you, for Paige and everyone here today, for inviting me back, to really talk through this question, are we wired, for racism? But before I get to the book, I want to first invoke the spirit of Mahalia Jackson, and also the spirit of the late Reverend C.O. Franklin. Particularly those two individuals, which is very ironic for me as you play that song. I'm on my way to Canaan land because I've been in crisis for the past 2 to 3 years. And I would posit, or I would, promote that I think we all have been in crisis. And the crisis we call is the Jesus crisis, which, and I use it metaphorically, in which we have, as a world, as a nation, seen ourselves become victims of idolatry. It is in this crisis that this book is birthed. Is how do we get such a spirit like Mahalia Jackson to sing a song that says, I'm on my way to Canaan land, right? And we're talking about freedom. We're talking about a divine presence in our midst that allows for us to pursue this freedom. But yet we still remain in chains. This is the genesis for our inquiry into our investigation of understanding what is happening in our brains. More importantly, what's happening in our world, our society, the institutions in which we find ourselves connected to in some ways allegiant to. So that song made me think about the ways that we took the name Jesus and made it into something else, something much more beautiful. Because if you would recall, the very first ship that literally charted the waters of the transatlantic slave trade, the name of that ship was named Jesus. And so, remember, I said this is a crisis. And so I'm holding these patterns of intention because in order for us to be able to understand the foundation for the argument of being wired, we first want to understand where we begin. And so, how many of us have actually read the text or have gotten the text, Wired for Racism? Anyone? Well, I encourage you, we got some. Amen. But we start with, in the book, we start with the murder of, the lynching of Ahmaud Arbery. We start there because when you think about the year 2020, a lot of people are talking about the pandemic. We were talking about police brutality. We were talking about the year of vision, right? 2020 is a metaphor. But most of us, well, a lot of people don't actually begin with the Ahmaud Arbery. Because it doesn't fit a narrative of police brutality. It doesn't fit a narrative because justice was served. Right? 3 white men serving life sentences for literally killing this man, this boy, this child. And we start there because it ironically places in our view the entire crisis at heart of the book. We have systems that fail. We have racial discrimination. We have systemic violence being justified. Everything that we talk about in this book is literally demonstrated in the murder, in the lynching, in the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. And so that frame was interesting to me because, one, I was there for all of them. And I saw how it impacted his family and how it impacted his community. And I saw how it impacted the world around us. And that was before the video was public. But then when the video goes public, we begin to see this kind of commercial investment, if you will. And it wasn't because yet another black body was laying dead in the street. It was because corporations felt it beneficial. While everybody's at home during the public health pandemic, watching the news, seeing death after death, brutality after brutality, we have to do something. We have to get the hearts and minds. Right, sounds like a military campaign to me. But we have to win the hearts and minds. Remember that from Iraq and Afghanistan as a military campaign? It became a commercialized campaign to capture the minds of people, remember the minds of people sitting at home watching on CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News. I know you're not supposed to say that name anymore. But the minds of people literally all over the world were reaching out, saying, what can we do? This can't happen here. This shouldn't happen here. This is not us. But in fact, it is us, we argue. You think about Mary Turners of the world, whose husband literally the day before she died was lynched. And the same people who lynched her husband goes to the church. And moments later, lifts her up, puts her on a tree. And a pregnant Mary Turner's baby, after she's deceased, is cut out from her body. This is us. So how do we get here? The wiring for racism. And so in the text, we start with this concept called idolatry. We call it the racial idolatry. What does that mean? What we're wrestling with is this notion that we've created entire idols out of identity. Some of us may call it the culture wars, or some of us may call it identity politics. So I would argue that it's something so much more deeper and so much more sinister that if we look at and investigate how we got to this place, we would be concerned about how we have begun to invest in organizational categories that literally dehumanize everyone. Each one of us. And it's hard, it's difficult to kind of navigate this uncharted territory because we literally create entire institutions based on that one fundamental lie that God created most of us in the imago Dei, the image thereof, and then you have the others, what we call it the otherizing. It didn't start with race, it started with the word citizen. If you were, in the eyes of Constantine, if you were a citizen, that meant you were of God, you were a believer. And if you were not a citizen, we could kill you. And since then, generation after generation, we've seen a kind of deviation, if you will, from this one fundamental lie that in order for you to be divine or divinely connected, you must have been a citizen. How does this manifest itself today? We use words like felon, which categorizes a class of people who are incarcerated. They lose their access to voting rights, lose their access to legal representation in some instances, economic sustainability, being charged literally slave wages, if anything at all. And most of us say or do nothing. They live in inhumane conditions, but they're not citizens. Because they've done something wrong, and so therefore they must be treated as animals. Matter of fact, worse than animals. Citizens. Others that we see, immigrants, refugees, as they sit on cages at our border. Notice, we're not in the Trump administration. We're currently in a Democratic administration where everything's supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to have been better. Immigrants, refugees. Then we have the poor. The people who are unable to pay for food, for housing, or they're homeless or houseless. People who simply cannot just make ends meet. We treat them too like them. And I say we inclusively because I believe in the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. And so therefore there's one person who is otherized, then I too am responsible. And that's the genesis of this text, because we're trying to understand how do we develop social structure that literally ostracize the least of these. We claim ourselves to be, me and Mark Ellenson, who is a church historian. He was actually my seminary professor of church history, and he taught my grandmother as well. And he comes from this perspective, and me and him, we are wrestling because he raises the argument of white innocence. I'm a person of white privilege, and therefore, I'm using my privilege to kind of make it better. And I challenged him. I said, well, what privilege it is to exist? What is privilege about literally being able to live while others are not? That's not a privilege. That's your human right. But our minds have been structured in a way that believes that some people are deserving of life and others are not, and therefore we must adjust according to that one fundamental lie. And so there's tension in the text. We wrestle with that. I don't believe in white innocence, nor do I believe in white privilege. Because I believe that the human condition is inherently divine, and every single one of us should be able to do such. It's not a category of your whiteness that allows for you to have that privilege. It's a category of your humanness. The moment we put the category of racial identity on it, it becomes a lie. That's the argument that I popped in, and you'll see in the text, and I encourage you to read it, not silence. But you'll see what I mean by this, because this is it's not a new phenomenon, but we've seen this push in some ways that people say, well, I'm white, and so therefore I have privilege, and I need to do something. Yes, you must do something. But it's not because you are white that you must do something, but you do something because it is right. It is right. The least of these. Next, we call this notion of breaking down or eradicating ourselves of this racial idolatry. I call it's a suicidal undertaking. Now, what do we mean? It is literally revolutionary suicide for us to challenge the racial idolatry. Because again, started with the word Jesus, right? In the name of Jesus. And I'm a Baptist preacher, so I go there. And I use it metaphorically because as the Roman Empire would not once, not twice, but thousands of times give the designation Jesus to individuals who committed acts of treason. Right? If we were to, in this season of Lent for us, if we were to take that example and apply it into our context and understand that we were too called to be enemies of the state and to commit treason. What is the punishment for treason? Death. And so, for those of us who want to dismantle racism, in a non-religious, a non-theological, non-spiritual, well, it can't be non-spiritual to dismantle racism, because it's a spirit, it's a power. But in a non-traditional sense, you must be committed to a suicidal undertaking. And when I say that, people are like, well, I want to die. I kind of like life. It's pretty. But if we are truly committed, that means we must challenge power systems, structures, intentionally. Because literally the weight of racism is suffocating people every single day. I watched my mother, who was a single parent of 4 children. You talk about, well, she went in Irish, but she didn't have a lot of money because she was a young parent with 4 children. You didn't have to have the other 3, you just didn't have me, and one could imagine what struggle she had with, whether it was discipline or the fact that I ate literally everything in the house. But in the real sense, people every day are struggling under the weight of this idolatry. Our job is to call it out and to declare the message of good news. And the good news is that we all are heirs to this legacy of the divine humanity. That is how we eradicate the racial idolatry. But then we say, well, I want to, struggle with this tension that you present to me, and I see what you mean, but what does this actually do for me every single day? Right? Like, how can I actually tangibly see it manifested in my life? Because this is a theological exercise for some of us, and others it becomes a very theoretical, exchange. We're debating philosophy. We're talking about these very grandiose ideas that somehow, some way we're connected, but I really don't see the relevance. But then Memphis happens. The name entirely different, where Black law enforcement, we spent the whole of the last 10, 15 years saying we need more police officers that look like us, that live within our communities. We're going to be safe. And these officers, Black officers, beat a man, Black man. Yeah. And I sat back before I said anything. Well, obviously, I said this is an injustice, and we need to do everything we need to do. But then I took a step back and I watched the commentary, because if it were not Black officers, I think the response would have been different. But after the summer of uprisings, where we saw the brutality that was racism manifested in the life or the death, or the life and the death of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, the list was on, we thought we had made progress. Until we went to Memphis, Tennessee, and saw one of the most racially segregated communities in the nation. This was a Black city. This is not supposed to happen here. What is happening? Is racism still manifested in communities that are homogeneous to one identity? My argument would be yes. Because the idolatry is not about race at all. The idolatry happens when we create institutions, when we create cultures, when we create identities, and in so much as we create responses to those situations and circumstances that literally allow for some people to be considered human, and everybody else as other. That's literally what happened. He was beat by 5 cops. And what shook me was he called for his mother. Just want to go home. See, when you think about the slave narratives and the archives that demonstrate how people during that time, particularly those who were captured into the slave trade, how they were taken from their families, beaten, children not able to be literally held by their mother or embraced by their father. That's what we do with animals. Well, I think we treat animals a little bit better than that. But the point I'm trying to make is there's almost a sense of false security that we have developed in our society, in which the very fundamental flaw is the idolatry of race. That we just focus on giving a few people the opportunity to, move up in the world, create a few, endowments, or, get a few pay increases, jump to the next tax bracket, which I won't advise because the taxes are crazy. But if just enough of us make it, we get the first black president, we get the first black woman vice president, we get the first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court, there obviously has been progress. Because we have made strides in racial justice. We've made progress because now we have representation. As if the representation alone is the end state, the end goal. The reason why we have come together to discuss this question or this quest, this search for justice. And so, where I'm going is, in the text we talk through this phrase, being black in a white world. And we use that language because black being is not about the skin color. It's not about the racial classification in which someone on the census has to fill out and declare that I'm this, that, or the other. What we're saying is that there's a system of otherizing that takes place that allows for those people to never be accepted, regardless of what station of operation. No matter if you're in Atlanta or Statesboro, no matter if you are in DC, California, New York, or even Mississippi or Louisiana, that if you are not white, if you are not a part of that dominant elite class, and let me be very clear, there are some black people that are white. There are some people who look just like me, who talk like me, but will never be able to relate to the metaphysical reality that my people face. They're African American, but they're not my people. And I think we oftentimes have to make that distinction, because if we don't, what we fail to do is to call out the evil that takes place in the name of Jesus. Institutions like, well, I'm not going to call out the names, but I could, that are literally birthed out of racial segregation. Organizations that we go to each and every day, hoping that they're going to do something, say something, move the needle on some kind of question about injustice, but yet they are still, in some ways, a part of the idolatry. So what do we do with this? Is it enough for us to have black faces at the table, on the city councils and county commissions? Is it enough for us to have black women, black men, Hispanic men running for these offices of political elitism? Or are we actually in search of something else? Because you cannot be a white person, and no, when I say white person, I do not mean the racial identity. I mean a person committed to the maintenance of systemic oppression and injustice and violence. How many of us are white people? You follow where I'm going. It's a different way of thinking. But you cannot be a white person and not contribute to it. Because in the contribution in which a white person has, it sustains that very system of violence. So our hope is, and I really want to leave time for questions. I want to have a conversation, but that was really on my heart, because when we organize ourselves, we say, well, there's this injustice, this injustice. You gotta make sure a black person is at the front. You gotta make sure they center the voices of those closest to the pain. And then we get them, and I can say this, I'm a person who works in the space. We get the person who is the furthest away from the pain, but they just have the right color on their skin. And that's how we get violence that happens in the name of justice and Jesus every single day. Right now, communities represented by those who should get it. I'll start with Atlanta. Cradle of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. King, David Abernathy, Jesse Hill, Ralph David Abernathy, John Lewis. And those same Julian Bond, and right now, Kratos and Lexington, the largest wealth disparity in the nation. $90 million being spent right now to eviscerate forest land that was promised to Black communities for literally 30, 40 years. And instead, we're going to build a big training facility called Cop City. Black mayor. We've had Black mayor since my mom was born. I can't remember last time they had no mayor who wasn't African American. Black council. He wears nice sneakers, look good, fashionable. To be quite frank, his mom taught my grandmother how to do hair. But in this moment, we are seeing the kind of violence, protesters, environmental protesters, currently being charged with domestic terrorism. We're seeing the legal system being weaponized. We're seeing our schools being eviscerated. So a few that are considered to be white, right, can make a few bucks. While everybody else is left to fend for themselves, we're seeing the all-out war against the human condition. That's what this is about. Can we truly resolve the idolatry that is race? Because we have seen legacies of violence enacted because of it. That's the genesis. That's how we got here. That's where we are. We can talk about, in the book, we talk about the economics behind it. We talk about, the farms. Down here in Bullock County, we got a lot of, farms and agricultural space. And we talk about how the FBA promised those Black farmers just equity, right? Just equity. They weren't asking for anything, different from anybody else. But if you're going to forgive the loans of farmers, I'm a farmer, so forgive mine too. They were excluded for decades, for generations, intentionally. Think about education and how, redlining has caused a crisis when it comes to public education funding. Georgia defunded it about $10 billion $100 billion over the last 10 years. And all of a sudden, you get it back to, pre-COVID levels. And we fully funded public education again, only after taking $100 billion from it. Racism. Talk about how students in public education, private education, regardless of what the institution is, how some students' behavioral issues are seen as threats to public safety, while others are just in need of some development or supplemental development instruction. Racism. Talk about healthcare, how Black women are, 3, 4, 5 times as likely to die. And not just in maternal death, but also just in the delivery of care, right? Racism. I don't think what people are going in, well, some of them may, but people are not necessarily just going here and seeing, but that's a Black person, I'm gonna make sure they die. I don't think that's what's taking place. I was told there was a case where there are formulas used to see whether or not a person can get access to certain care, right? And one of the conditions of that formula is race. And if you are a Black woman, you are less likely, in fact, it is almost impossible for you to get this particular treatment. I can't remember what the treatment was, but it was like a cancer or something to that effect. And I thought to myself, it's called Medical Apartheid. That's what the book is called, Medical Apartheid. And it talks about these ways in which we've organized ourselves to prevent certain communities to have access to care. The last thing I'll mention is there's a community, how many of you all heard of the town Juliet, Georgia? Juliet's about, I was about 10, 15, 20 minutes from Macon, somewhere around that town. And Georgia Power, I'll never forget it. There were coal ash ponds, right? Georgia Power's power plant to deposit coal ash into facilities that were like lakes. And have you seen one of those? But there's like little lakes, they got fences around it, and matter of fact, when I was president, I called John on it, it's like, hey, come take a tour of it. I think I would be happy to. Just so I can have the accurate depiction of what you are doing. But the coal comes in and deposits the waste into this pond. They are not lined. The ponds are not lined. We changed the law around that a few years ago. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, thankfully. The ponds were not lined, and so if you're putting coal into water, and people are drinking well water, they're drinking cold water, right? And so cancer rates skyrocket. In the white families in those communities, there's about 97 families in that small kind of region. And out of the 97 families, 88 of them, I believe, 87 or 88 of them were white families. Every single one of those 88 families, their properties were bought through Georgia Power. They bought the property. Guess who's left standing? Every single one of the white families. They can't afford to move, but they're stuck. By no fault of their own. This is not happening in Flint or Mississippi and Jackson, right? With the water crisis there. We're not talking about Chicago, in which the nuclear power is literally being created. Well, we can talk about it here too, we play the vote, but I'm not gonna go there. We're talking about families, children, literally being killed because of racism. That is the real consequence of this idolatry. Trying to navigate in my head, how do we get here? What do we do with this? And how do we move forward? And so in the book, toward the end, we're talking about tangible steps that we can take to actually address it. Because granted, everybody don't want to talk about racism all the time. No, I don't either. But I recognize that what's happening is that people are profiting off of the misery. People are profiting off of the ignorance to how all of this was constructed. It didn't happen overnight. And it didn't happen just by happenstance. It was intentional. And so it requires us the same level of intentionality to reject the idolatry, re-engage the humanity, and ultimately manifest the power that is community. That is the promise. That is what makes us so divine, so beautiful, is that we can operate as human beings, as brothers, as sisters, as friends, as family, to build the beloved community. That is the answer. It seems as cheesy and simple, but it works. And when we are able to come together, break bread, and to recognize and embrace the differences of diversity while also understanding there is beauty in our community. I think that's when we win. That's when we are victorious. So I'll stop there and see really if there's questions or comments or feedback after talk. We can do that now because I really want to hear. Because and let me say this. I don't approach the conversation as an expert that has the answer. It's important, and me and Mark are very intentional about saying, we're inviting you to wrestle with us. Because obviously, what we've been talking about for centuries, for centuries, that's not working. Because if it was, we wouldn't be where we are today. So something has to change. So let's look at the formula for how we organize ourselves, understand the impetus behind those, understand the impact behind those, and let's see if we can actually change something up and see if something else works for us too. Because We were not created black and white. Scripture that I read says, Yahweh took the Adame, blew the Ruach in it, and it became a living soul. And what the Creator saw, the Creator didn't call it black. The Creator didn't call it white, gay, straight, trans. The Creator saw what the Creator created and called it good. That's the point. How do we take our humanity and make it good? I don't care for it to be popular. I don't care for it to be politically expedient, right? I want it to be good. It's Augustine. No, I'm sorry, I said Thomas Aquinas. Who called it evil, wretched, dirty, sinful. I get in trouble in seminary all the time. And I tell them, I say, I reject that fundamentally. He said, but it's at the center of your doctrine of faith. I said, well, to hell with the doctrines of faith. I'm an heretic. They call a lot of the other church fathers a heretic. But, oh, I am being recorded. What is, I wanted it to be good. So that's what the Bible is.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sam?